Hi, Jenny.
Good
Welcome,
morning.
Jeffy Stefanotti. I'm so happy to have you, founder of Denison Community. You are, you're someone that when I'm in your presence, I've only met you in person once, but we can feel when somebody is a trustable leader. We can feel the quality of integrity, the quality of care, the quality of someone who's actually developed their way of thinking. Like that's all apparent just in my first interaction with you, and then is deepened through the beautiful podcast you have and the meaningful content that you're putting out and the call to what Denison stands for. But I just want to reflect that to you because I think that it's true for all of us that we know on a deep level when somebody that we're in the presence of can actually be trusted and
Mm.
trusted because they're standing for something that's whole and they're doing their work on themselves and they actually care about each other. They care about the world. They care about the people around them. And so I just want to reflect that to you. And I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing and taking the initiative and seeing the impetus for an important conversation that's very timely.
I felt that way. And we're going to be speaking about resilience from both a personal and then more collective systems level. That's when we'll bring Amanda in, Amanda Joy
Yeah.
Ravenhill, and weave her in. But let's start actually with steward leadership because a lot of what Mia was speaking to was quality of stewardship. And
Hmm.
so I would love to hear from you. What does steward leadership mean to you?
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. Denizen just kind of came unexpectedly into being during the pandemic when a lot of people started to show up for the conversations that I was curating on Clubhouse. And I initially kind of gave myself the title of curator because I was curating conversations. Um, and then there was so much interest, it swelled to tens of thousands of people who were interested in having the conversations. Like, oh, this is something bigger than that. And I said that Denizen promoted me to steward. And so my title at Denizen is steward. And it is really from that inception of responding to something that really came into being in its own right. But also, I think it's really essential as we think about like where we are versus where we want to go. There's this paradigm shift from ownership to stewardship, this sense of like, this is mine to control for my own benefit versus a relational orientation that centers care. Um, so I think steward has a lot to do with that. I think I know Amanda's obviously familiar with Denizen because she's been a part of it since it wasn't a thing. Hi Jenna, nice to meet you. Um, but really, Denizen is at its crux a provocation to uh, realize that through our everyday behaviors, we are implicitly endorsing the very systems that are causing the degradation of society that we're experiencing very acutely right now. And that when we come into awareness of that, and if we can think about like what does a society look like that actually yields the outcomes that we want for humanity and our relationship to the planet, we can change ourselves, right? So, like, we're going to talk about Buckminster Fuller when we get Amanda on momentarily, right? But Buckminster Fuller has this very famous quote that, you don't change the existing model, you define the new model that makes the old one obsolete. And there's a very famous Gandhi quote, which is be the change that you want to see in the world. And so a lot of what Denizen is doing is intersecting those things. It's a ongoing conversation that's exploring like, okay, well, what is that? What is that alternate model that's going to make the existing model obsolete? And like, how do we change ourselves to manifest that? Um, and so from a leadership perspective, I am like totally full of shit if I don't embody that and walk the walk and not just talk the talk. Right. And so what Denizen is, in addition to the media and content component of it, is it's a community of practice of people who are slowly, the URL is becoming Denizen. I can put it in the chat in a little bit. But it's really about a community of practice that is upgrading itself in all the ways to become a denizen of a system that like actually reflects the way that we want to interact as a species with the rest of life on earth. um, and so when you think about resilience, I mean I think it's really important also. Denizen's tagline is change from within, and so I want to talk about, because the kind of the headline for this event is resilience, and so I think it's really essential to talk about resilience at the personal level to begin with, because if you don't have an awareness of what that looks like, then you're going to kind of perpetuate a collective nervous system that is reactive rather than responsive, that is more scarcity minded versus abundance, that's more fear oriented versus love oriented. And so all of those sort of more ostensibly higher leverage systemic interventions are actually futile if they're not coming from the right place. So I don't want to. So that's it. So when I think about steward leadership, first and foremost, it's like practicing what I preach and embodying those things, but also really thinking about. We'll get into this when we get to kind of from the personal to the organizational context. But I think it's really critical to think about centering relationships and care versus a more of a transactional default, the way that we tend to kind of orient in our organizational structures.
Yeah, so one of the keys that you said about steward leadership is centering care. And in order for us to care about others, care about the earth, actually impact positively, what you also said indirectly is that we need to have a nervous system that is not reactive, but is actually like a peaceful place to be. Because if we actually care about people, in order to impact them positively, it matters how we're showing up just in our own nervous system, in our own state of mind, emotions. And so while it's very collective, it's also personal, and they're both. And that's why I'm excited to have this conversation with the two of you is, resilience does span the personal into collective. And so as a leader, as a mother, as somebody who I believe lost both your parents close, as someone who's navigating life, leading a community, leading organizations, you went back to Harvard, there's many things you've done, beautiful things, challenging things, that's asked a lot of you. What have
Hmm.
you learned about personal resilience in order to be an integral steward leader?
Yeah, last year was a very big year for me on the personal growth front, and it's something that I'm writing and sharing more on my personal Substack, which I just launched a couple weeks ago. I've been blogging on and off for a lot of years, but I think that it's really essential to understand um, some really basic things about how your body works and how your nervous system works, and I think most people are pretty oblivious to that. So understanding your nervous system. Like what happens when you get triggered and you go into your sympathetic nervous system versus your parasympathetic nervous system? How does that affect your cognition? How does that affect the way that you relate? I did some really deep work on my marriage last year, and that's where I like really came into awareness of all the ways that how we show up in our nervous system and our awareness of our nervous system is really essential to keeping things on the rail. I mean, I think um, when we talk about resilience, it's really and we're going to talk about this with Amanda, but it's really important to understand system dynamics. And the system dynamics, the same dynamics are at play at all levels in the system. It's that those dynamics are at play in your body. They're at play in your dyadic relationships, and then they are at play, and so on and so forth upwards. And so, understanding this sort of one key concept it's really relevant is reinforcing versus balancing feedback loops. So, a reinforcing feedback loop is when something happens and then it amplifies, right? And so you get in a fight with your husband, right? He says something, it triggers you. You say something back intended to hurt him. He gets pissed off. He slams the door. And so your nervous systems are getting like increasingly escalating in the way that they're interplaying, right? Versus a reinforcing feedback loop is like a thermostat. The temperature starts to get beyond a certain point, and then like the heat kicks on to bring it back to the homeostasis that you've set it to. In the context of that exact same example of like a fight that you might have with your spouse, if you read the Gottman Institute's work, it talks about repair, these repair attempts that happen in these fights where you're like, hey, you seem upset. Do you need to take a couple of breaths? Instead of, let me get more upset and then make you more upset, right? And so having an awareness of those feedback loops is really important for resiliency. So how can you cultivate those sort of practices to have balancing feedback loops in your own nervous system that bring you back to your optimal zone? That would be called like optimal zone resilience. And let me just actually put a quick link in the chat, but there's an episode that I did on the podcast on optimal zone resilience.
I'm
Um,
here actually, and I'll share it in the, many people will be watching via replay, so I'll share that out in the email
yeah.
in the chat here.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, yeah. So that's the one with, yeah. That's the one on Spotify. Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of them. There's transforming relational conflict. There's conscious leadership. There's a lot of ones that are relevant for the things that I'm speaking to here. So I think maybe if you just want to send out a link to like the listen, that's all the podcast episodes from the website. That would be the best place, and then that links to Apple or Spotify. Um, and so, yeah, I think in my own body, better understanding that when I'm not in my optimal zone, which happens when I allow myself to get burnt out. Like we live in a cultural context that doesn't value rest. It's okay to say I can't come to your event because I have another commitment. It's not as socially acceptable to be like I can't come to your event because I just need to like lie on my couch tonight, right? And so we're in these like chronic like stressed state to begin with, right? So doing the practices to be more connected to your body and understand when you need rest. Like people are just disassociated from their body in general. They're not resting when they need to. They're not drinking water when they need to. They might be pushing themselves to work out harder than their body is actually telling itself that they need to that day. And so cultivating a totally different relationship with your body, I think is really essential, right? So that's awareness of what's happening in your nervous system. It's also just awareness and honoring your physical needs. It's feeling your feelings. Like what happens when we numb out or we suppress, like these come back to haunt us in unexpected ways when we like suddenly, you know, freak out and react to like some random comment at the cash register at the store, right? If we go to the store and we're not ordering from Amazon, which we, probably are doing anyway, but you get my point, right? And so it's like if you don't change your relationship with your body, you're going to show up in a more reactive state that is less calm, that is less compassionate, that is less curious. And we all understand the kind of interrelated nature of our nervous systems, where, you're at the store and somebody goes off on you and you feel that in your body and it takes a while to kind of shake that out, right? But also if somebody's like really nice to you and gives you a hug, like you feel the way that calms you down, right? And when we are living in a kind of social context now where like the emergencies are happening, like, you talk about what's happening at a systemic level, at a climate level, you're seeing these reinforcing feedback loops. Like the climate emergencies are getting like more intense and they're happening more frequently. And so we are going to have more and more of an assault on our own nervous systems in these moments. So cultivating that internal resilience is essential. And also really critical is understanding trauma and our nervous systems and the fact that when we have trauma that's not addressed, we may be in a homeostasis that's a dysregulated state and we don't even know it. There's a conversation about trauma in the nervous system that I did with this woman, Danielle Rubio, where it's like, you think this is you, but this is the you that hasn't dealt with your trauma, right? That like walks around being more reactive. And so I think there's just this whole kind of baseline that is absolutely relevant for anyone that is a human being today to understand and have a different relationship with your body and different set of practices so that you can show up as your optimal self. And I think there's a really critical piece of this around connecting to your intuition. It's super relevant for this conversation about transitioning from a society that is like clearly fundamentally fucked to one that's something different. And we are all deeply indoctrinated in the current social context. So that tells us that our self-worth is about our resumes and our bank accounts or how many Instagram followers that we have. We all have internalized bias that we would like to believe it's not there, but guess what? It is, right? And so connecting to our intuition is incredibly potent to know what's true for us and not to just unwittingly perpetuate these social norms that are at odds with like the way that we want to be in the world and the relationship that we want to have in the world. So that connection to intuition is really, really critical. And if you want to get spiritual on it, on that is this kind of source, this knowing where the interconnectedness is clear, where you make a different set of decisions. And so there's just this enormous landscape of what does it look like to be resilient at the personal level. And if you don't understand and take accountability and responsibility there, like the rest of it is just built on a fundamentally faulty foundation. And so a lot of what I'm doing as a leader is peeling back the layers of the onion in
Mm.
my own life and work and practice, and doing that out loud, and curating opportunities for the denizen community to do the work with me. Not just the conversations on the podcast where I share some learning, but like, oh, well, let's do a nonviolent communication class together. I mean, we'll talk about organizational stuff next and where that leads. But that's kind of my wrap on the personal kind of foundation for resiliency.
That's powerful. And I'm asking one more question on the personal, then we'll go to the organizational. So you're speaking about rest and being disassociated from what we need from our body, getting burnt out, and intuition. I'm actually connecting those because we're all clear that we're less resilient when we're tired. Like we're just more reactive. I think we've all had those experiences and we know that to be true. What I'm in inquiry around right now in my life is around capacity to be able to do more, but then knowing that line between building capacity and not putting this idea of limitation on myself, but also knowing when is it actually is my capacity so that I have enough rest. And I think intuition comes into that, the ability to really know what's for us, what we're capable of. That you're someone who's created a lot, you're creating, you're mothering.
Yeah.
How do you think about leadership capacity and that dance between saying yes to contribution, but
Yeah.
also making sure that you actually have the adequate amount of rest and downtime to listen to your own intuition and listen and do deep work
Yeah.
like writing? And I'm just curious how you're holding that.
Yeah, I mean, one of my mantras is say no, do less. Less is more. Simplify. And so I think a lot of that is like first and foremost held in a clear context of what are your priorities, and let's get clear about what your priorities are. Um, so in this past, even this like since we turned the corner on 2025, I've tried to be a lot more intentional. So even within the context of Denizen, I've pared down the scope of what I've been doing to just really be able to focus more and execute. I realized I stretched myself too thin. Um, our relationship with our phones, I mean, is like you want to talk about like having more capacity. Stop fucking checking your phone 100 times a day, right? The way that that is sharding our attention is huge. So I started using this app called Opal, which I'm an enormous fan of, that allows you to set these like really stringent commitment device in your phone. So now on my phone, I can only open WhatsApp or Signal or Gmail or Instagram twice a day, period. So I am never responding to text messages with my thumbs on my phone. And so that is both, supporting me in being more present with my kids, but also being more like effective and efficient. So that's one, is just like reform your relationship with your phone, because that also like shifts your attention span. But I think also equally critically is get clear about what your priorities are and work effectively. So I also started using this productivity planner that Intelligent Change makes, and their whole premise is like, what are your top, what are the 3 to 5 tasks that you need to do today in order of importance. So the premise is that tasks 5 through 150 are the ones that screw you over, because you're not actually focused on the things that are important. And so you start with number one and you don't actually go to number two until you're done with number one. And you do your work in 30-minute increments, and you get rid of all of your distractions, and you focus for 30 minutes, and then you take a 5-minute break, and then you do it again. And I started working this way since January. And I'm just like, how the fuck did I used to do that? Where I was just constantly fielding text messages and checking emails and interrupting myself. Like it takes me half the time it used to take me to edit a podcast episode, because I'm not interrupting myself anymore. So I think like having those sorts of practices are really important. Um, but also like really critically, and I think Amanda and I have just been like, on parallel journeys with this, is just like, how big is your container because of the care that you're, exerting towards your body? Like Amanda, I miss her, but she moved to Ojai because it's like better for her nervous system, and she was able to slow down. And I moved from San Francisco to Mill Valley. There's more friction for me to go out, so I go out less. Like both of us have stopped drinking. Like drinking is something that makes your container smaller, right? Okay, so you have two, right? And so these are all the ways that we can like make our container bigger, right? but also just really stay very clear about our priorities. So even, and I think this is a really critical in the context of how I think about steward leadership and embodying the change. Like a huge piece of it for me is valuing caring for my kids in a society that tells me to fucking lean in, right? Lean in and like work until 5 and then come home for dinner and then get back online, right? And like that's not the world that I want to create. And so like I value motherhood and I value caring for my kids and I place a lot of time on that and that inhibits like how much I can work, but it's part of my work. That's the thing. I think about how I live my life as my activism, not work as being this separate container. Because I think it's really important to realize that if you don't have that holistic frame, you're kind of unwittingly perpetuating far more of the problematic attributes of of the overarching system than whatever like point solution you're trying to address. Right. So when I give myself permission to stop working at 3:30 to pick up my son from school, or permission to stop working completely for 6 months, as I did when both my parents died, you mentioned that before, or even last year when I gave myself permission to take 3 months off when my marriage was in an existential crisis, like that's me doing the work, but doing it differently. Right. And so I think that that frame is also valuable.
I feel to bring Amanda on now to actually have Amanda chime in briefly about the personal before we start to zoom out. Can I bring you on, Amanda? Because I know you've been on your own journey of also cultivating your own resilience, and you're someone who is called on a lot for many things, and you're a very, very wise thinker and leader and systems designer, which is so needed in these times. And so both of you probably have nonstop invitations, and I think you even fielded some health challenges recently. And so before we start to zoom out, we like to build on this holistic perspective. Jenny, thank you for sharing. It was so beautiful. Amanda, why don't you start with the personal? What have you learned about personal resilience? And then we can build out.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think just like to frame resilience briefly, I think of it not just as like adaptation to disturbance or like a bounce back ability, but really an opportunity for transformation via that adaptation. So if you look at like complex adaptive system science, you see that like complex systems are inherently adaptive, and it's because of disorder. Like every complex system has disorder. Quench disorder is like the technical term, but there's like disturbance so that the system can change and really transform. And I like to think of every kind of crucible of transition in life, as painful and awful as they are, as like kind of going back down to the well and addressing and metabolizing anything that's like unresolved there, you know. So like when I'm in transition, even if it's just like I'm sick and they're on antibiotics for something right now, actually, it's like, okay, this is a time to like be able to excavate and to, in that personal resilience, like how can I use this opportunity to transform and also rest? And it doesn't need to be like all work all the time, but that like that appetite for transformation really shifts things a lot, from being like, you know, hard stuff comes up and all of your armor that's helped you, you know, be healthy in the past and was needed in the past is maybe not relevant anymore. And so it still comes up, and it's like that audacity really to be like, okay, is that actually needed anymore? Can I go in and can I excavate and find like what's like the truer truth and kind of like unpatterning that wants to happen right now.
Mm.
So yeah, that's kind of like the frame that I look at it with. But yeah, that again is within like a whole field of rest and regulation. And, you know, I've gotten into a lot more around like vagal tone and breath work and like the Jing Chi bridge within Taoism. There's like a lot of practices I do on the weekly now that are very different than how I was living a couple of years ago.
Mm.
Including
Yeah.
standing on a balance board while you're on the calls
Yeah.
most of the time, which I
Yeah.
haven't heard one because of you.
Nice.
Because postural health, there's so many layers of resilience on the personal collective level, but I love how you framed it and an appetite for transformation. I think about resilience in three kind of basic aspects. One is what you're doing and how you've built your business such that it's resilient, meaning that when challenges come or crises come, you actually may not be impacted by them, or the world could be going mad, but you're actually still living this beautiful, thriving, vital life, and so is your family, and so is your organization. And then there's who are you? What happens during a challenge, transition, change, unexpected, or what happens in your business? Are you adapting in real time when you're having to actually practice resilience in real time? And then there's kind of the after. If there's been a major challenge, change, crisis, illness, COVID, fire, whatever it is, then how do you rebuild and learn from it and become better? And to me, that's the transformation part and a mindset that keeps you resilient. Because the world's uncertain, there's disruption, there's change. We're going to all navigate massive changes, and we already have. And so, can we look at it as an opportunity to become better, to actually learn from our past and our missteps and not keep repeating the same things over and have that inform how we create new systems? So, I'm just kind of framing, that's how I think about like there's just some elements of resilience. And so
Yeah.
let's take that frame now into more of the organizational. And we can kind of interchange organizational and community. Both of you are community leaders. Both of you either lead or have consulted and helped build a lot of organizations. How do you think about the design principles to create resilient organizations or communities right now?
Yeah. Um, Let me answer. I just want to kind of build very briefly on Amanda's, and this like supports the bridge. But I think that there's like, what I wanted to speak to when we moved to the organizational piece, and then I'll talk to some design principles because obviously we worked. I was lucky to work with Amanda when she was leading Buckminster Fuller Institute. So, and I have a design background too, so there's lots to say there. But I think there is this like important point about consciousness and the level of consciousness from which we are responding. And to Amanda's point around an adaptation that is transformative, right? And so and I think you eloquently kind of underscored, Charlene, it's that like learning and adaptive. So from a design principles, I can say like, yeah, there's experimentation and iteration. So being aware that like everything is an experiment, you're constantly getting new information. How do you internalize, metabolize that new information, and then like learn from it? In the context of organizational work and leadership, um, conscious leadership, I just did an episode with Diana Chapman. That was last week's episode. And she has this really interesting and I think powerful frame around, she had four different kind of frames of consciousness that you can lead from. And the first one is where most people reside, and it is to me. The world is happening to me. I'm reactive. I'm the victim. I don't have a lot of agency. I'm going to blame everything else. And it's a very disempowering orientation because things happen outside of your agency. And then you move into by me, which is a very potent frame that basically says, I am 100% responsible for my reality. And how can I look at what my role is? And that is the way that you can learn from exogenous shocks or whatever might happen in order to be adaptive, per Amanda's point. Um, and then and also really critically within conscious leadership, there's this frame of like the world is happening for me. It's like everything is for me to grow. Like I'm working on a blog post about what I learned in the intense crucible of losing both my parents 3 months apart, right? So I think that frame is really important. And then the other ones, it goes so through me, where this is where like it's less of a, I am the agent than I am tapping into some source and it's coming through me. And then the other one is as me, where there's like, it's coming from a place of oneness and there's not a separation of me from everything else. But yeah, from a design's perspective, I think understanding that like everything is an experiment, and putting in place practices and processes to harvest new information. It is continually coming up and adapt policies in the organizations or practices in the organizations or the services or product that you're delivering, for example, I think is pretty important.
Anna, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there. One thing it reminds me of, I don't know if you know Byron Katie's work, but when we
Yeah.
first started Project Drawdown, Paul Hawken was working really closely with her, and she was the first one to say to me, is climate change happening to you or for you? And that was such a huge shift to like, I'm like I literally have business cards that say Queen of Silver Linings. I'm always looking for the silver lining. But shifting kind of the, global upheaval and just fucking crazy metamorphosis that we're in, as like, how can we learn from this? Okay, climate change is teaching us that we're all one community, that there is no separation. Climate change is enabling like some of the most advanced climate computer dynamics models. And there's all of this, that, and you can hold both. It's not like I wish it on anyone, but there's a bigger picture, and like anything in systems thinking is about like zooming out and seeing what's downstream and upstream, and looking at the full picture. But yeah, we can move on. Jenny and I could talk for like 8 hours. So
Yeah, I know. These fast.
There is desire for a part 2 of our conversation on the podcast. Amanda was one of my very first episodes on the podcast when I launched a couple years ago. And my dear friend Nada, who's also brilliant, has joined us. So she just popped something in the text.
I see that. How do our stories create our future, and where are we giving our power of creation? So I'll build on that a bit, actually, because Amanda, you have been a part of several amazing organizations and have probably been asked for support and advice on many others with well-meaning leaders. So what I see is that there's a lot of well-meaning leaders and a lot of beautiful intended organizations, and some work and some don't. Some affect change and some don't affect change, at least to the scale that they were hoping, or they fall apart, or there's many outcomes that happen, and oftentimes the outcomes are not necessarily aligned with the actual intention that the people started out with. So I'm curious to hear from both of you what you've learned about leadership or organizational design that you feel is important, that makes an organization resilient and actually fulfill on the desired and intended outcome, or what you see gets in the way of that actually happening. Amanda, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's so much. We could teach a whole course on this, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is like just interpersonal relating. What's coming to mind right now, just because I've been so deep in her work lately, is Joanna Macy's work of the spiral of the work that reconnects. And I think a lot of, especially working on like, systems change projects, there's a lot of people coming to the team with like so much passion, so much desire for a different world, and clarity that it's possible. And then interpersonal dynamics get in the way. And the like passion for a better world can also be mixed up in a lot of grief that, many of us have been working on this for fucking decades. And like, such little progress has been made, like backwards progress in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so that like that unresolved grief can show up through interpersonal dynamics. So encouragement to look at Joanna Macy's work. There's a great podcast with Jess Sarante, who did a 10 series interview with Joanna last year. And the spiral of the work that reconnects goes through starting with gratitude, honoring your pain for the world, seeing with new and ancient eyes, and then going forth. But yeah, I think a lot of interpersonal stuff comes from like, especially in this kind of work, just comes from this passion, having this unresolved grief underneath it. So I think grief work and grief spaces are really critical as we go forward, because we're going to lose a lot. Like, I like to forecast the best possible futures, and I've done that with Project Drawdown and with Buckminster Fuller Institute. And even the best case scenario is not all roses. Like, there's going to be a lot of change. And if you look at metamorphosis and phase change, like that tends to happen there. The chrysalis goo and, the messiness of a snake shedding its skin, like if you look at these systems dynamics, it's just like, it's a messy metamorphic time. And yeah, it's important to like separate what's what within that.
But I think this also bridges to Amanda's points, kind of take what we were talking about earlier about the individual work and like, let's look at how that shows up in an organizational context, right? If you are not adept at feeling your feelings, like if you don't understand that this is a highly emotional time and don't have spaces in your organization for people to feel and process those feelings, that will show up in dysfunctions in the relationships within the org, right? If you don't have practices to understand, like, are we in our optimal zone and do we need to get back to our optimal zone in a conversation? If you don't have an organization organization that is willing to have hard conversations, you are going to miss a lot, right? So what are the organizational practices look like that facilitate that? Understanding conflict resolution is really critical. Nonviolent communication is transformative when you learn that. Really fascinating conversation I had with somebody with a restorative justice background who looks at like, how are we patterning from the restorative justice system these kind of stories of like somebody's right and somebody's wrong and somebody should be punished. That fundamentally puts us in an adversarial orientation when conflict really is an opportunity to better attune and connect and learn something new. So organizational practices that like have clearing processes or harmony restoration protocols in place to address that and not have that stuff fester, I think is really, really important. Let me speak to Denizen as an example here, because we are talking about leadership and the things that we're doing in our own practices. One of the things that I think is really critical is centering care and being relational, not transactional. So I really, when I do my annual retreats, these are very focused on building community and building relationships, not talking about our resume, not broadcasting content, right? When you get in any Denizen meeting, it starts with dropping into our bodies with 5 breaths and then going around the room and having like a genuine check-in around how's everybody doing. It starts with the relational component of it. And so thinking about how to put in place organizational practices that reflect that, I think are really important, because then you're less likely to have organizational breakdowns because those interpersonal dynamics are problematic. And I find so many people in this space like are banging the table for action without understanding that there's a right way to do it, both from a relational perspective and process perspective, but also from a strategic perspective. Like we need to sit back and like think about some of these things too. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I want to pick that up and share one of my values about organizations and teams, which is moving at the speed of integrity. And to me, so nature moves fast and slow. And so it's not always about moving slow, but it's about knowing when to slow down. And sometimes if we're synced, if we're in coherence, we can move very fast with integrity. But knowing when the system is no longer coherent and we need to actually slow down, maybe do some repair, come back into harmony, and make sure we're connected to our own self, our own intuition, and to each other. Because pretty much all of our trauma happens in relationship. And so while there's work that we need to do for ourselves, spiritual, emotional, mental work, until you're in the dojo of relationship, whether in love or in business, you can't even see necessarily what needs to be worked on. And so there's a lot of conversation these days about romantic relationships being the space that mirrors back to us and shows us where we need to heal. And there's more ownership happening in that domain. But that same level of intimacy is happening with our colleagues and the people that we are doing work with, and especially co-founders. And so a big part of my work with teams is having them create spaces for connection and healing, because it's a huge opportunity as well. We can do our greatest personal work in our relationships, but it's very hard if the organization doesn't prioritize our own collective growth as a team in addition to the work that we're doing. And it's hard because we have, especially if there's investors and there's a board of advisors, and the bigger it gets, the harder it can be to actually have those systems in place. But Amanda, I'm curious what you've seen. We can kind of wrap this organizational conversation here. It's a nice idea in theory and much harder in practice, just like many of the ideals that we have. I'm curious to hear an anecdote of how you've seen that work, or what you feel if you've had a model of an organization do interpersonal relationships really well, and if so, what was in place that had the interpersonal relationships for the most part work really well and have longevity.
The one that's coming to mind is this incredible group I worked with at Buckminster Fuller Institute. We kind of incubated a bunch of projects. One is Regenerosity. The URL is regenerosity.world. And it's basically finding like Buckminster Fuller-esque types around the world, people who are tuning into nature's design genius. A lot of grassroots projects. And the team, we were all over the world, from Malawi to the UK to the Amazon to California. And yeah, we just spent time, we rotated who was facilitating every meeting, so it always kind of felt fresh. And then we would spend time, and it didn't even take that many minutes, but maybe 4 minutes at the beginning of every meeting to just check in. So we knew who had a niece that was just born or who was going through whatever. And it really made such a big difference. And then when we launched, we had this one kind of pivotal moment where we were like incorporating the organization, and one of the guys on the team was studying earth wisdom and earth religion, and he led us through this whole ritual. We all brought seeds, and it really felt like we were together, in spirit at least, but through this kind of like using symbolism. And I think that's just a really important tool. We're all like mythosomatic beings, like we live in story as, our bodies and ourselves. And yeah, the power of symbolism, I think, is underused a lot. I've studied a lot with Starhawk, who's this incredible permaculture teacher and earth activist, and she talks about ritual having all the senses that you can deploy, a symbol and an intention. That's all you need for a ritual. But like that symbol part is really the core. So are you lighting a candle as, a symbol of this notion of I am starting this new thing? Are you planting a seed as a way to say, before lightness, there is darkness? But that symbolism can be so potent, especially done across teams. And yeah, it was really beautiful. It was beautiful, of course, to see those plants grow too, and
I
be
have,
connected to one another.
yeah, a shared ritual to bring us together.
Yeah.
Just whatever can actually bring us together, I think is the key there. And I know we have just scratched the surface. I want to say goodbye and thank you to Jenny so that we can give you, Amanda, the spotlight to transition us into a probably more systems conversation. Although I know, yeah, this is you two are so wise. And you have really done the work to be integral leaders and are continuing to do that, and that shows you role model what it looks like to walk with hope and faith for the world, and also what it looks like to take yourself on and stand in the fire over and over again. And so I see you both. Jenny, why don't you leave us with any closing thoughts, maybe an invitation, if there's a inquiry you want to leave people with, or an action you'd love to invite people into, and then let us know how we can connect with you online.
Yeah, I mean, again, my core provocation is to understand that there are so many things that you do in your everyday behaviors that are perpetuating the system itself, and the work is to understand that the work is holistic. It's not enough to start a social enterprise. You need to think about what are the incentive structures, how are you capitalizing it, what kind of culture are you creating, and in doing that, I think you really get this kind of almost like inherent virality that comes from changing yourself and then the people that you touch, like, and so on and so forth. So that's the provocation I would want to kind of leave everyone with. Becomingdenizen.com is the website for Denizen. There's a newsletter I send out every time we have a new piece of content. I partner with a lot of organizations, including Buckminster Fuller Institute. So I also send out announcements from my partner organizations. We have online community events in addition to the media. So there's a lot going on under the hood. And then I'll comment I'll make a comment in the chat and hand it over to Amanda to not use any more of that time. But I think Nada's point about stories is really important. So I'll make a comment there, but maybe you might want to say something, because I think it's really important to understand the ways in which our narratives and beliefs are constraining us if we don't think about them differently.
Constraining us, or I mean, we live in story. Culture is ultimately story. Ritual, in a way, is shared story. And so, yeah, I'm sorry to overlook that question, Nada, because it's true that life is basically the stories we tell ourselves and each other. And actually, Lucian, who will be on in about an hour and a half, will speak about storytelling. So please join us for that, because his thing is all about the stories we tell for thriving futures and bringing people together into a new story. So we will be touching in that with a bit more depth after the break. Okay, Jenny, thank you so much. Okay, Amanda, I think you have a presentation for us. So I'm just going to give you, you should be able to share screen. Let's double check
Yep.
that it works. Perfect. Okay, take us into the resilience toolkit. Amazing.
Let's see. Is that playing full screen?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think my main question for folks for now, and also just to take with you, is just what tools have you collected along the way? And I think we're all more capable than we think we are. And we have a lot of tools that might be ones that we collected or used for one reason and can be applied for others. So just to get into it, we'll kind of talk about first like the resilience paradigm, something like the systems dynamics of resilience, and then get into, we'll actually start it the other way, then we'll go into personal, interpersonal, place-based resilience and planetary, and I'll just share some of the tools that I found along the way for all of those. But yeah, meant to be kind of an ongoing conversation, an invitation for all of us to kind of codify a bit like the tools that we do have in our tool belt, because I think it's one of the kind of dynamics of metamorphosis is that we're more capable than we know. So Buckminster Fuller talked about humanity is like a chick just hatching from its eggshell, and we have way more capacity than we know we have. Like a chick just hatching, like it's just discovering that it has feet, that it has feathers, it has wings, and it's grown for growth's sake, but now has this capacity to live in a regenerative paradigm. And I think likewise on Earth right now, we're using corporate personhood to give personhood to the rights of nature. We're using satellites and so much of the space race that was part of the Cold War back to, understand the Earth itself. So yeah, an invitation to just sit into how much more capable are you than maybe you think you are. So Jenny shared this one earlier, but you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. This is one of Fuller's most famous quotes. And I think it's worth just spending some time thinking about maybe something you're struggling with now and how you might be really giving it a lot of attention and saying, why can't this thing change? Why can't this thing change? I just want this thing to, to grow and evolve. And then, maybe just like imagine yourself turning a 180 away from that thing and saying, what else could there be? What other set of patterns could there be that I could give my energy towards that would make that existing thing I'm trying to struggle with become obsolete? And this can happen from the personal to the planetary. One way that we're going through this metamorphosis, this phase change or state change, as it's sometimes called, is reimagining what is capital. So we've mostly been focusing on financial capital, and now more and more people are talking about natural capital, social capital, experiential capital, and really realizing that, this is one way to slice it, and this is complex and overlapping. It's not meant to be like a perfect picture of how the 8 forms of capital all work with each other, but how can we kind of evolve and adapt to see the larger whole and see this this world and our interactions as really different flows of all these different forms of capital. And in doing so, on the resilience tip, one of the ways I like to think about resilience is this term anti-fragile. So it's not just being unbreakable, but actually as things come and disturb the system, how can the system become stronger? And I think focusing on 8 forms of capital is one way to do that, that it's not just about like resisting, but it's actually about like blooming and becoming stronger as disturbance comes into the field. Another way I like to think about this kind of evolution of forms of capital is this idea of cascading benefits. So again, as we transform and go through this phase shift, we're being better systems thinkers and better kind of zoom out context holders. And instead of just unintended consequences, how can we look to build resilience in systems, across the board, across all 8 forms of capital? So when you invest in women smallholder farmers, smallholder farmers grow 70% of the food on this planet. And when you invest in them, they create more nutrient dense food, which then kind of, that in itself creates more investment in them. There's higher income, they educate their children, they invest in their community, and these all form kind of these jetties of this virtuous cycles of value creation. And similarly, across more of like an ecological vector, there's more carbon drawdown that leads to healthier soil, climate resilience, water retention, biodiversity, and these all support one another. So as we are becoming more resilient, I think a really key part of it is seeing from the systems dynamics point of view and looking from this resilience paradigm. How can we create resilience not just in one place, but really multi-solve and create resilience across all the forms of value in the systems we're working in. So yeah, so now just going to go through a bunch of resources I found that are kind of in my toolkit, and an invitation for you all to think about the ones that you have and to share them with folks. Teaching is really the best way to master any skill. And so as we share things that we have, the more likely we are to like kind of codify them into our own ways of being. So this is the 4-7-8 breath. It's one of the best ways to regulate your nervous system. It's a 4 count in the belly, 7 count of breath with your tongue on your palate, and then 8 count out breath through pursed lips. And you can do this 4 times. Sometimes I do it in the middle of the night to fall back asleep. Sometimes I'll do it after just like something agitating happened. And just knowing you have the tool to like downregulate. Sometimes I do it before public speaking just to like recenter and come back down. Even just knowing you have the tool is empowering in itself, and like knowing that you have the ability to be aware of your nervous system and regulate it as you need and as you want, and to be in control of that boosts your resilience. There's a bunch of different videos you can find on this. Dr. Wheel has a good one. Another practice I use a lot is RAIN from Tara Brach, which is a 4-step process, mostly with dealing with hard emotions, though she does say, use it with moments that you want to remember that are really beautiful. But the 4 steps are recognize, so like name the emotion that you're going through, allow, just allow it to be as you are. I investigate, which is more of a somatic, where is it tingling? Where is it hot? How am I feeling this emotion in your body? And as you do that over time, you'll kind of build a map of, oh, when I feel anxiety, I like feel it, on the right side of my tummy. And so you can, over time, have a map where you can just do a body scan and be like, oh, looks like there's a little anxiety showing up. And then the final one is nurture, which is just, giving yourself self-love, putting your hand on your chest, rubbing your ears or rubbing your neck. There's, different ways to boost oxytocin in your system. Into interpersonal, of course, the spiral of the work that reconnects from Joanna, Macy. And this is purposely interpersonal. So this is work to be done together. And it reconnects us to one another. And as we start with gratitude and honor the pain for the world, see with new and ancient eyes, and then go forth, we can really find way more depth in our relating and depth in our communities. Encourage folks to listen to the podcast We Are the Great Turning that just came out last year through Sounds True, and with the host Jess Sorrente. Another one that I've learned about recently is this website called Polis, which was worked on by Audrey Tang, who is the digital minister of Taiwan. And it's this tool to help people see where their values and where they overlap. So much of social media and the algorithms and AI and everything is AI-driven algorithms that are boosting the attention economy, is really teaching us to be these divisive, outlandish, salacious commentators. And this is really kind of trying to retrain us to find the bridges and where we agree. So there's more and more tech coming out. There's the Jigsaw Labs, which is doing a big project in Bowling Green and Kentucky to see like how can we make sense of these large scale conversations and find where we're overlapping instead of just dividing. On place-based resilience, these are dear friends. I've been advisor of Taryn and Hilo, which is an incredible community of care and practice working at the bioregional level. Hilo is a social network where you own your data, and it's all rooted in really beautiful integrity based on nature's design. And there's a lot of incredible communities on there, like Zebras Unite, and a lot of regenerative ag projects. Earth activist training, I'm on the advisory council for this. This is Starhawk's permaculture course online. And so they do certificate and diploma programs, different classes, different events, and it combines permaculture with activism with spirit. And there's just so many beautiful projects on there. There's a whole program on resiliency from a permaculture lens, like disaster response and preparedness, and how to look at that from nature's design genius. So definitely encourage you to look at that. They have free events often as well, and lots of scholarships available. On to planetary resilience, I started Project Drawdown in 2013 to show that we actually do have so many more solutions than we're giving ourselves credit for. Back to the story, we're constantly in this like doom spiral of self-fulfilling prophecy of imagining all of the potential dystopian futures ahead. And really, there's not a lot of these prefigurative features, like what is the future that we want? And if you look at cognitive biases, there's the availability heuristic or availability bias, which is at the individual level, that which you have available to you. The examples you have in your head is more likely to be the path that you take. So if you know 20 people who published a book and you have all those examples, it's going to be much easier for you to do so because you can just picture all of the different pathways forward. So if you like run into a roadblock, you can be like, oh, but there was this other way that it's possible. And then the availability cascade is the cognitive bias at the social level, which is that which the shared vision becomes a shared reality. So if we have this, I'm sure Lucian will talk about it, but this like hyperstition of, that which we all want, this future, or sets of futures ahead that we want, then we're more likely to unfold into them. So that was kind of the impetus behind Project Drawdown. We did this analysis on 80 different climate solutions and mapped and measured and modeled them over 30 years to see their climatic and financial impact. And this is one way to slice the pie. There's many ways to slice the pie, but there's so many things that we can do to achieve drawdown and then actually peak not only concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions, but also temperatures. So potentially in our lifetime, it's not looking too good these days, but in our kids' lifetime, we can get back to lower temperatures. And then the final one here, planetary resilience, is the Stockholm Resilience Center. They're the ones that do all the research on tipping points. And you can see here that there's 5 tipping points that are currently in the danger zone. So these are systems dynamics where it becomes very, very difficult and in some ways impossible to reverse these feedback loops once they start. And we are, this is a hard one to sit with. It's system dynamics, so you don't know exactly when things tip. You can only know in hindsight, but we're in the danger zone for 5 of these already. And I don't know. I get a loss for words looking at this, but worth looking at Stockholm Resilience Center and all the work they're putting out, and just to educate yourself, because I think there's a lot of if you're doing the grief work and everything, there's a lot of energy behind knowing what's happening and feeling the call to change. And then the final part is just, this has been a theme throughout this whole summit, but the way out is in. This is a calligraphy by Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a wisdom keeper that I follow closely, even though he's in our ancestor realm now. And just an invitation for all of us to up our involvement in a wisdom path, do more mindfulness practices, and just be able to operate from a coherent, connected mind, body, spirit. Thank you.
Thank you for this, Amanda. Can I follow up with 2 questions?
Mm-hmm.
Stop sharing your screen, even though this image is beautiful.
Oops.
No. So I think we all felt your emotionality in that last, just the reality that you're so present to, of the change and the destruction that we're amidst. And I'm curious, as someone who's been in climate related initiatives for a couple decades, is it?
Yeah.
And you just mentioned earlier how there's been very little progress, and in some cases it's gone backwards. I was just speaking to our mutual friend Christopher Crone as they start their new company, and just the sentiment that it's like, even if you give it your all, you never know if the world is just gonna like eat it up. You know, if it's actually, the change is going to actually hold. And also we have so many solutions that just haven't been deployed at scale. And that gives me a lot of hope. When I was at Climate Week in New York City, so much inspiration, hope, because people are geniuses and the innovations are extraordinary. And we have so many solutions, and many of which just haven't been deployed yet. So I'm going to ask you a personal and then more of the collective of how we deploy those at scale. That how does one stay resilient? How does one stay aware of what is going on and continue to move forward with the grief, but also not letting the grief just consume us, and not letting you, also not feeling like the whole world is on your shoulders, because that doesn't help either. I see a lot of people in climate and related impact industries, they burn out because they feel like they have to do something and they have to fix the world, which I also think is not healthy either. So I'm just curious how you hold that for yourself.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot there. Um, I mean, one, it's like the systems dynamics piece just has me hold it in such a different way because I'm so nerdy on that kind of stuff. And one is that like we have made a lot of progress if you look linearly. When I first started working on this, it looked like we were going to reach 11 degrees increase in temperature rise by 2100. And now it probably looks like, well, now with this new circus, whatever you want to call it, it is probably more like 3 or 4, but it was at like 2.5 by 2100. And so there's quite a bit of work to celebrate there. Like that's a lot of work. However, systems dynamics wise, like yes, it matters 11 degrees or 2.5, but also like once we go over 1.5 for too many years in a row, that's when all those tipping points happen. And so it's like it's like a seesaw. It's like you can tip off. But similarly, like that's one thing to hold, but also similarly within systems dynamics is this like phase change where, it seems like things are moving like this, and then all of a sudden it just poof, like, shifts into a completely different state. And it seems like we're seeing a lot of signs for that to be possible right now. So that's one side of it on systems. And then one of my mentors is Tom Chi. He was the board chair at Buckminster Fuller Institute. We worked really closely together. And he always talks about, maybe there's 1,000 of us. Hopefully there's like 10,000 of us working really hard and like focused on the greenhouse gas issue. There's so many different issues, right? And not to say one is above the other. They're all interlocking and make each other worse. And solving some make each other, easier to solve. But he's like, if there's 1,000 of us, we each just need to do 1/10 of 1% of the work, and so yes, that's a lot to put on your shoulders, but you're not putting 100% of the problem on your shoulders, just like 1/10 of 1%. That seems achievable. So I like to hold that too.
I love that. It comes back to Jenny speaking about what's your priority. I think about this phrase, stay in your lane, because as aware people, we see all kinds of areas that we could impact and that we would love to impact change. But it's like, what is spirit life actually putting right in front of us that is high leverage that we can impact? So I love that frame. And also, you have this frame of systems thinking. Jenny shared a framework from conscious leadership around happening to me versus for me. And so what I'm hearing, and maybe you need to find your own frame, but having a framework that actually empowers you amidst whatever's going on in the world, I think is an important part of resilience. For me, a lot of my spiritual philosophy and framework makes me strong and resilient. So yeah, zone of genius stuff. I love that. So the last question, it's a big question. So just pull down one lever point, which is, okay, we have a lot of innovations and we have a lot of solutions and we have a lot of brilliant ideas. And there's many layers as to why it's hard to deploy those at scale. But if you could just leave people with one, like, what could we change individually, or what perspective can we hold that would enable us to deploy some of these solutions at greater scale? Like, what do you feel is a lever within that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And amid
Um,
the current circus, which let's not
yeah.
talk about a new president because that feels out of reach, at least for 4 years. So something a little bit more that we have
Mhm.
some autonomy over.
Yeah. It's a complex one, but it's one I'm excited about right now. As they say, the radish picker points his way with a radish. I'm really excited about AI's ability to, lead us into a phase change. It is all sorts of dangerous in many, many ways. And I have a lot of friends working on, slowing it down and regulating it. And it's creepy. How, yeah, beyond creepy. I mean, it's devastating how much is being destroyed in terms of collective intelligence with it. And it's also an incredible tool. Like, try to stay on top of AI. It is insane what it's capable of now. And so I think more and more people should be using it to, apply to systems change problems. And I think there's this, yeah, it's complex again. Some of the data centers are really putting a lot of communities out, and there's, people wanting to boycott it or saying, every search is worth this many gallons of water and slow down and don't use it. But if we don't use it, like those of us who are rooted in ecology and rooted in making this world a better place, then, how are we going to outweigh all of the destruction that it's creating? So you can create an entire company by yourself now. Like, there's so much support out there. You can do everything so much faster. Not everything, a lot of things so much faster. And so, yeah, that's what we're doing with my new company, TMRW. Tomorrow, we're building this ecological AI that enable people to make really simple decisions based on a lot of complex ecological data that improve their resilience and their community's resilience.
Sweet. So I love that you ended with this. I was just on a trip in Big Sky, Montana. That was a convergence of Hub Culture, Summit Impact, Hatch, and Future Horizon. And we had a panel about AI, climate. There were some other topics. That was the main topics. And when we had conversations, we kind of all had this consensus that if we work on our own consciousness in collaboration with AI, we will be able to solve the climate challenges. That AI will help us solve it. And as long as we're doing our personal work and consciousness and be able to collaborate, then we will actually be able to solve for the climate issue. And actually, Matt Letta was part of that panel, and he will be speaking next week. So I have a few, just so everyone knows, I have a few speakers that didn't fit in these 3 days. And so we'll continue with the series. And Matt Letta has a book coming out called Future Proof and The Leap, which is all about AI. And we have totally uncertain, unpredictable futures in some ways, but whereas also AI is helping us predict systems. And Amanda, I actually have someone to connect you with about this. So I love that, bringing that in. And for people who are very earth-based, there can be a resistance to technology. But I urge us all, I've been urging myself to actually learn and partner with AI, and don't let it be the thing, like for those of you like me who just let Bitcoin pass you by and kind of let tech, like I can kind of be slow on tech because I like to go move slow with nature pace, but I've been really training myself so that I can affect change and utilize the tools that are available. So rather than being afraid, let's actually teach AI ethics by engaging with it and use it for our and the planet's benefit. So it's a good way to end, and we'll double click on that with Matt. Thank you so much, Amanda, for the resources, the tools, everything from a breath practice to how to be in relationship to systems change at a large scale. Your mind is such a beautiful mind, and I'm so happy that you're doing the work that you're doing. And I know that it's been a true labor of love with so much devotion, and I hope that you feel so resourced and supported, right? That's so much of resilience, is that we actually have support teams around us. And so I
Mhm.
feel super supported in all the work that you're up to, and that tomorrow becomes really successful. How can we connect with you?
Yeah, on LinkedIn, also starting to put some more stuff on Substack, but LinkedIn's probably the best. And then we'll be announcing more about TMRW about tomorrow
Okay, great.
on
So is that
LinkedIn
the
as
best
we
way
launch.
for people to find you and about the company is via LinkedIn?
Mhm. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
amazing.
Also, if you're like looking for a place to scroll that has like good content, I recommend that. It still has some like sponsored bullshit. But I find following a couple people on LinkedIn, like key climate scientists, I feel like I can trust. It's like, I don't know why I'm being like a LinkedIn spokesperson right now, but it's where I'm finding a lot of good news right now.
Well, there's also deeper thought. So it gets out of the headline, just dopamine hit of Instagram and whatnot. And there's
Yeah.
the thought practice. And if you've actually given a lot of resources, I just want to underline quickly. Byron Katie, Starhawk and her permaculture work, Joanna Macy and the work that reconnects. There's a couple others that you meant. You just kept
Home Resilience Center, Terran, Polis. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. So thank you for being a wealth of resources, and that's something I see in you is you're really generous. You want people to know about the good work that's happening, and may we all take that on and really advocate for our friends' work and share about what they're up to and be the vocal point for the people that we trust because people are doing good work and often they just need help getting it out to the world. So be willing to be an advocate like we witnessed Amanda so generously do through this whole time. So thank you. I appreciate you. I love you, Amanda Joy
Thank you.
Ravenhill. And
Thanks for bringing us all together.
my pleasure. Okay, everybody, we are going to take a break. We will reconvene.